Well, good morning and welcome to all of you that have been able to join us. My name is Reverend Eric Hoheisel. I'm an associate regional pastor with the American Baptist Churches of New Jersey, and it is my pleasure to welcome you today to our Sacred Safe Spaces webinar that is titled The Intersection Between Domestic Violence, Marginalization, and Racial Bias. A couple of reminders as we begin today. The webinar will be recorded and eventually archived on the ABCNJ website so others can benefit from the information and wisdom that is shared today. If you have questions that come up during the presentation, feel free to type them in the chat box. And if your question hasn't been answered by the end through the course of the presentation, our speaker will address the questions and any additional questions that you may have as we come to the end of the presentation. If you, for some reason, bounce out of the webinar, you should be able to just click on the link to rejoin. I want to thank you for joining us and thank you for caring about these important issues. And we appreciate your being here today. Now I'd like to turn over to our coordinator for the Sacred Safe Spaces Initiative, the Reverend Estelle David, who will say just a brief word about what Sacred Safe Spaces is for those who are not familiar with it, and briefly introduce our guest today. So Estelle, welcome and go ahead.
Good morning, everyone. I hope I'm unmuted. Am I?
You're good.
Okay. The American Baptist Churches of New Jersey began a ministry called Sacred Safe Spaces. And what our vision is that our churches would become healthy and beloved communities where peace, mutual respect, justice, and love are upheld for everybody. So with our Sacred Safe Spaces, we're trying to have our faith leaders, congregations, and neighborhood groups working together to equip our community to address the ills that are in our community, such as domestic violence, child abuse, and elder abuse. So we've been offering these webinars, which we'll post it on our website soon. So if you missed one of them, you can always, tune in later. And I'd like to welcome Will DuBose, who is going to be our presenter today. And I look forward to what Will has to say, and he'll tell a little more about himself. Will?
Good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone.
Okay.
I'm really excited and happy to be here in the space today. I consider this a privilege to be able to speak to you this morning on such a delicate subject. I hope that the information that I share with you today will be useful and enlightening to provide some guidance and some direction along the lines of some of the things we've been hearing in our world today. My name is Will DuBose. I'm the prevention coordinator at the New Jersey Coalition to End Domestic Violence. My primary work is to engage men and boys as allies in the work to end domestic violence. So today I'm going to be bringing to you a presentation on the intersection between domestic violence, marginalization, and racial bias. So we're going to get right into it. Once again, as Pastor Eric has mentioned, if you have questions, I will field those questions at the end of the presentation. So let's jump into it. So what I did today was I named this the Pathways to Change conversation. Is an opportunity to engage in education and conversation around creating true change within the communities we live and work in. True change can only be achieved with an understanding and identification of the oppressive systems that have been put in place to stagnate the change process. This educational conversation will focus on what a believer's response should be during these times. So some key terms that we're going to jump into today that we're going to discuss. And I'm going to ask Pastor Eric just to kind of hold me accountable to our timing, because I know sometimes when I get into a subject matter, I could get pretty passionate about it, and I'm not aware of my time. So I'm going to ask Pastor Eric to hold me accountable there.
I will do so, Will, and we love passion.
Excellent. Well, you're going to get a whole lot of it today. So some key terms that we're going to go over are, first, we're going to define domestic violence. The next term will be marginalization, and then we're going to look at racial bias, and then we're going to talk about how they intersect together. So let's get started here. All right. Okay. All right, so what is domestic violence? So if we were in a space together today and I could see your beautiful faces, I would ask you this question and everyone would raise a hand or make a comment, but I'm hearing all of your voices say some different things. So we're going to jump right into what the definition is. So if we take a look at the definition of domestic violence, it's a violent or an aggressive behavior within the home, typically involving the violent abuse of a spouse or partner. So domestic violence is something that is a subject matter that really largely people believe happens in certain pockets or certain places. But having been a Batterers Intervention provider, direct care service provider for 15 years of my career, which pretty much encompasses my whole career because I've been in the work for 16 years. So the vast majority of my career has been working with individuals who have caused harm to another person. And I want to just kind of dispel some maybe a faulty assumption that domestic violence happens in a pocket somewhere in a part of your state or a part of your town or a part of another place and it doesn't happen here. That is not true at all. I'll give you an example. A lot of times, what happens when you read the newspaper or you see the media show up at a particular crime scene, where you see the unfortunate circumstance of an individual who has killed his whole family and then turned the gun on himself. When we talk about that, if I was in a space with you, I would say, what does the media normally ask questions of neighbors? Neighbors, they'll say, well, tell us about the family. And they say, oh, they were a beautiful family. They were great people. He just cut my lawn the other day, or he just, we never saw anything. We never imagined that this would happen. Well, and I say that to you because domestic violence doesn't always have a paper trail. It's not always visible. And so I want to share this with you because I want to dispel, once again, that faulty assumption that it's happening in isolated pockets in certain places. Domestic violence is an equal opportunity abuse. It's happening to everyone and it's happening everywhere. So hopefully they'll invite me back for a part 2 of this to something else, but I'm going to move on to our next term. So what is marginalization? Once again, if we were in a space, I would be asking you that question. You would raise hands and you would give out some information. But hopping into the definition of marginalization is a treatment of a person, group, or concept as insignificant or peripheral. So when we talk about marginalization, particularly this term has been synonymous with communities. So when we're talking about marginalization, we're here marginalized communities, meaning communities where people are treated as insignificant. Unfortunately, in our day and age, the marginalized communities primarily are heavily populated by Black and brown folks, particularly in our urban communities. The treatment of those individuals is often seen as they're often left to kind of fend for themselves. Marginalized communities don't often have the resources they need to really succeed and really thrive as other communities have the opportunity to. Marginalization really affects a lot of different things when we're talking about particularly subject matter of domestic violence. Domestic violence victims in marginalized communities are not really taken serious. They're looked at as if they maybe in some cases even deserve the abuse that they're getting because of the perspective that people who live outside of those communities have on individuals that live within a marginalized community. So the next key term that we're going to talk about is what is racial bias. Racial bias is a form of implicit bias, which refers to the attitudes or stereotypes that affect an individual's understanding, actions, decisions in an unconscious manner. So if we talk about the attitudes and stereotypes that affect an individual's understanding, actions, decisions in an unconscious manner, we're all taught things. You know, this world is filled with information. And depending on, you know, when you grew up and the era you grew up in, depends on is depending on how much information you were getting at that time when you were brought up. We can all say that if we were, you know, if we're probably in our 40s or older, information came in different ways. It came to us in different ways, and it wasn't so mainstream as it is right now. But nonetheless, the information that some of us were privy to, or the education that we got when we were growing up, forms and shapes our attitudes. It shapes our beliefs. It shapes our perspectives on things. And, you know, depending on what kind of community you grew up in, depending on what your race or your background is, that also plays in as well. So you have your gender education, you have your racial education, you have your cultural education. So all of those things begin to form attitudes, beliefs, ideas. We have stereotypes about particular groups of people. For example, if not putting it on a racial platform, but just saying on a gender platform, if you grew up and you were the only boy and you had all sisters in your house, you know, there were certain jobs that the boys did, and that helped form an attitude and belief. And then there was stereotypes that came out of that you know, the girls may have thought that, no, we don't do that job, that's a boy's job. Or the young man who was the only male in the house amongst his sisters, you know, believes that I don't do that job, that's a girl's job. And so those things, and I'm just using a harmless example of how attitudes and beliefs are formed and stereotypes get formed. Now, if we take that and we continue to, you know, matriculate that into teenage and then adult years, when you're moving away from the primary information source is your family, and you're moving into, now you're getting information from your school, now you're getting information from friends, now you're getting information coming from a lot of different places. So there's a constant shaping of attitudes and beliefs and stereotypes that affect us as people. And we'd be very naive to believe that we don't have some sort of biases towards individuals, towards certain races, towards certain subject matters. And so it's important for us to acknowledge these things in order for change to really happen. So moving on, if we talk about the intersection, so here's where we kind of jump into the meat of things. If we're talking about the intersections of domestic violence and marginalization and racial bias, the intersection comes with this. Domestic violence is the circumstance, okay? So it's the overarching circumstance, if you will. And then when we talk about the intersection is marginalization and racial bias, where they collide and they come together is that often people in marginalized communities are experiencing racial bias, and they're experiencing domestic violence. They're going through circumstances, they're going through situations, they're experiencing these unfortunate things that are happening to them. But what happens is that because there's stereotypes, there's ideas about the communities they live in, their claims of or incidences of domestic violence are not believed. They're overlooked. There's resources there's not a lot of resources available for someone who lives in a marginalized community who is seeking domestic violence help or assistance. There's not a lot of resources available to that individual. So the way that this works is that the racial bias and the marginalization of people prevents true change. It keeps communities stagnated. The racial bias and the marginalization work hand in hand. So if you see, I didn't just do the coloration of these words accidentally. I did them purposefully and I was very intentional about it, because when we talk about this, they're all intertwined. Looking at marginalization as a standalone, looking at racial bias as a standalone, and looking at domestic violence as a standalone is a mistake. The intersection of all of these terms and these subject matters is important to understand if we're really going to create change. Understanding that marginalized communities are experiencing domestic violence at a disproportionate rate than other communities is important to understand. But you're not going to understand that if you're having a racial bias towards the people who are in that marginalized community. You're going to believe that, that it's only happening there, or that that, as I mentioned before, that, people there are, less than, or that they're, they kind of deserve what they get from that, in that community, or they've asked for that, or they brought that upon themselves. And those biases prevent people in marginalized community from feeling like they have a voice. They're feeling like they're left out. But nonetheless, the domestic violence is still something that's prevalent in the community and is a real social ill, as Reverend Estelle had mentioned. It's a serious social ill that's not being addressed because of the outlook and the perspective that people have on those folks who are experiencing domestic violence in these particular communities. So it's really important to understand that we can't separate these. And I know I'm being redundant, but I just want to be clear to make a point. We can't separate marginalization. We can't separate racial bias from domestic violence. They're all interconnected. So if we move on to our next slide. So when we talk about change, well, you're saying, you might say, Will, okay, you gave us all this information. You're talking about these terms and what they are and how they intersect. And you might say, okay, well, what do we do about it? And I'm glad that you asked that. I'm glad that you asked, okay, what do we do about that? See, us as believers, and I'm just so excited to get the opportunity to say that, us as believers, see, we have a privilege that a lot of other people in the world don't have. And that privilege is that we have the Spirit of God that lives within us, that gives us an enlightenment, that gives us a special perspective, a special lens to look through life, to look at life through. And so when we talk about change as a believer and change that happens in the world are vastly different. And so for us, it's important for us to focus on getting back to the right side of the cross. We want to make sure that we are on the right side of the cross when we're addressing issues. That yes, the Bible says that we are, that we are in this world, but we are not of this world. And so it's important for us to make sure that when we are addressing issues, that we're not doing it from a worldly perspective, that we're making sure that our faith is driving how we handle situations. So if we take a look at this, how do we do that? How do we allow our faith to really drive us to being on the right side of the cross when we talk about all these issues? Because the world right now, these terms that I've mentioned, amongst other terms, are very hot button terms right now. So you're going to hear, if you haven't, you're going to hear, and hopefully I'm educating you on marginalization. you're going to hear that term. You're going to hear racial bias. You're going to hear implicit bias. You're going to hear redlining. You're going to hear social engineering. And I want to just touch on social engineering. And I should have put this in the space as far as the slide. But when we're talking about social engineering is an effort to manipulate or coerce information to kind of steer people in a direction to have a certain belief about something. So if I was in a space with you, I would say, who are the biggest proponents of social engineering? And you would all raise your hands, or you would just speak out and say, the media. And I would say, ding, 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 ding. You're absolutely right. The media is the biggest proponent of social engineering right now that we have. And I'm not just talking about the media as in terms of like television. I'm talking about every source of media. We have social media, and not just one form of social media. We have many different platforms where you're getting a lot of different information coming from you from a lot of different sources. And this is all in an effort to socially engineer us into having a certain perspective or look at things through a certain lens. But as I mentioned before, if you are a believer and you have the Spirit of God living within you, you have the opportunity to choose to see things through the lens that Christ would want us to see it through. And I say it's a choice because being a believer is a daily choice. It's not just something where you just wake up in the morning and yes, you are saved and you did give your life to the Lord, but you have a decision to make that very day as to say, am I going to do my will or am I going to do God's will? Am I going to be am I going to live life through the lens that Christ wants me to live it through, or am I going to live it through the lens that I want to live it through? And so when I bring that back to us as believers to say, change means something different for everyone, but change for us means that we should be trying to make sure that we are in the correct perspective that is going to keep us once again on the right side of the cross. And yes, I said that a few times, and I'm very intentional with the reason why I said it so many times, because I'm trying to help us refute the efforts of the social engineering platforms that are out there. So if we move on to the next slide, and this is important. So it says, do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed. And I know it in the King James Version where it says, be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind. Or, but in modern terms, it says, do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. So that's what change looks like. So when we talk about this, if we're really going to have change, we have to renew our minds. We can do a bunch of physical things. We can change our spaces. We can move here or we can move there. But honestly, if your mind hasn't changed about certain subject matters, if your mind hasn't changed, I think that COVID has really showed us right now that we can't really move as freely as we wanted to. We can't go into this space or that space. We can't come together as we'd like to. We can only, we're limited to this virtual world that we're living in. And so when we're talking about this, transforming our mind is really the key to surviving right now. COVID has come in and really disrupted our lives. It shut down our churches. It's caused us to have to wear masks. It's caused a fear. It's caused a hysteria. And there's been a lot of social sensationalism. It's been sensationalized in some different perspectives, not dismissing the reality of COVID, that there's that the disease or the sickness is real and that people are dying, but there's stuff that's happening in the middle of this that that in an effort to socially engineer us, there's things happening in the middle there. And so I'm not getting off topic. I'm making it relevant to what we're talking about today. The racial issue in our country has had us in a place of unrest. We see rioting, we see looting, we see division happening amongst individuals, family members, co-workers. We see division, the efforts of the enemy to divide our churches as well too. But the important thing is to make sure, once again, that we are not falling prey or subject to the world's perspectives on things, and that we are staying close to what we know is the truth, which can be found only in God's word. So if we are staying there and we are really seeking to be transformed by the renewing of our minds, meaning that we may have some perspectives that need to be changed. We might have some things that maybe we were taught growing up. I'm a black man. I wasn't taught how to be a white man, and a white man wasn't taught how to be a black man. And in our educations growing up, being honest and being transparent, yes, there can be some biases that are taught to us. But if we're talking about renewing our mind and changing, we can't go back and erase history. We can't go back and erase time. But what we can do is we can acknowledge where we're at right now, and we can move forward. And renewing our mind, as the Bible calls us to do, is the beginning of change. It's the beginning of the change process. So when we talk about this, what can we do? First thing you can do is just take a pause for a minute. I find that sometimes we kind of run into things and we run through things, and we're not really taking that pause to really just take a minute to stop and evaluate yourself. Where are you as an individual? Who are you as a person? Have you checked your biases? Have you checked the perspectives that you have on situations and circumstances? What is your understanding about domestic violence? Do you believe that it happens in isolated pockets? Have you ever heard the term marginalization? Have you ever heard the term racial bias? And so I'm bringing that up because the important thing, if we're really going to create change and we're really going to make sure that victims or survivors of domestic violence voices are heard, they can't just be heard from one particular community. Folks in marginalized communities need to have voices, and you can help them have that voice, but you're not going to help them have that voice if you have a bias towards folks that live in a particular community. So that's important. The first thing is, and the next thing is to look around you. What's happening in your particular circle or your particular world or your particular neighborhood is not all encompassing of everything that's happening in the world. Take an opportunity to look at your coworkers. You might have someone who's in your office, if you're going in and you're working in person, because I know some people are doing that, or in your virtual space. But take a look at how people are showing up in the virtual space. Is someone you know not looking well? Domestic violence rates are skyrocketing right now because victims and survivors are trapped in the home with their abusers, and they're not having the opportunities to get to work. They're not having the opportunities to get out in public like they would before. They're not having those interactions, those social interactions that gave them an opportunity to maybe explain or to share the circumstances that they're facing. They're trapped in the homes with their perpetrators. And so looking around, not just being concerned about yourself, not just being concerned about your particular circumstance, but looking around and seeing what's happening to those who are around you is one of the biggest ways that you can help bring and shed light on domestic violence. And then listening. And so when we're talking about listening is just having your ears open to language. Sometimes people can't necessarily, be overt with what they're with expressing something, but they will use certain language. They'll maybe use some code language that is trying, in an effort to try to express that maybe they're experiencing something or that they're going through a particular circumstance. When we're talking about this, it's important for you to educate yourself. Listen to the language that's out there. If you're hearing a term such as like redlining, like I said, or social engineering or implicit bias, take an opportunity to Google it. That's the beautiful thing about technology these days is you can Google anything and get an understanding of exactly what it is and digest it and figure out where you stand on these situations. But always remembering that if you are a believer, that you want to make sure that you are on the right side of the cross when we're talking about this, and submit these thoughts and ideas and feelings to, you know, to reference the Bible, to make sure that you're walking in a direction that's going to be pleasing to God, and that that your witness of your faith is going to be one of which that doesn't look like the world's, but it looks like who you say you are is a believer in Christ. I think I'm just about at the 31-minute mark, and I want to just give opportunities for question and answers. I would have loved to have gone on longer, and that's fine. This is just kind of something to kind of whet your appetite, give you enough information to kind of go off of, and hopefully do some more research. You'll have my my contact information is here as well, and please feel free to reach out to me through email, or you can call me. Preferably by email gives me an opportunity to kind of set up a schedule to be able to call you back. But please feel free to reach out to me if you'd like to get more information. Also, I'd like to direct you to the New Jersey Coalition to End Domestic Violence website, NJCEDV.org. There's a lot of resources there that are available that it kind of expounds on these subject matters that I spoke about. There's also, we have a training institute that's there if you'd like to get some more information and training around domestic violence and in the particular subject matters. So I want to direct you towards that site. And if I can be of a resource to you, please don't hesitate to reach out. I want to thank you so much for your time, and I'll turn it back over to Pastor.
Well, thank you so much. I want to direct any of our participants now, if you have particular questions that you'd like to put in the chat box, we would welcome those. And while people are potentially putting questions in or adding questions, I wanted to ask a question of you, Will. I was thinking about, as you were talking about, what my bias is in terms of the stereotypes that I have about people who are abusers. And one of them that I grew up with was they're drunk or they have a drug problem. Like, that is the stereotype that I have. And I know that that isn't true. Are there questions that can be posed either to ourselves or others, particularly in our church community, that can help unveil some of the biases that we have about what domestic violence looks like?
Well, I would say that, you know, in terms of questions, it's kind of hard, but if we, I guess the one question is to ask yourself is my perspective realistic? Is it just one group of people that are causing harm? And even when we talk about it, and I'm glad that you brought that up, Pastor, because that is often the perspective, is that they're drunk, or that they come, that, you know, that they have a certain look. But I'll tell you this, in 15 years of me doing the work, I have individuals that show up in a suit and a tie, fresh haircut, look good, smelling good, walk in with a briefcase, are very affluent, coming from, you know, have an amazing job, or come have a tremendous amount of education or what have you. And, you know, it just really plays to the idea that that it's not just happening. It's not just one individual. There's no image of what there's no typical abuser image. There's no typical perpetrator of domestic violence image. There's no particular look of a victim. You have victims or survivors of domestic violence that are sitting in your body that you would never even know because they put on the makeup and they knew how to mask it, and they knew how to make themselves, you know, look the part in an effort to keep this quiet or to keep it isolated. So the biggest thing that we can do as believers in a body is make sure that we're checking in with those who we fellowship with. Making sure that we aren't that we make spaces for people to feel comfortable to share their truth about their particular circumstances.
Will, looks like Annette has asked about, I'm gathering, she would like you to say a little bit more about redlining. And if we didn't get your question right, Annette, please clarify that for us. But
okay, so when we talk about redlining, redlining is happens in, so, and this is where we see the intersection of all these things. Okay, so when we talk about marginalized communities, particularly communities, let's say, because where we fellowship, let's say Camden. Let's take Camden, for example. Camden is a red line community. And if you look, and this is not something that's I'm pulling up, off the top of my head, or something I'm making up. These things are facts. So if you take a look at certain communities, and we'll say Camden is a red line community. And what that means was that there's a particular map on the, if you look at the geography of New Jersey, there are particular communities that were designated at a time in history that weren't allowed to have mortgages, they weren't allowed to have certain resources, there was limitations on them. So those red line communities don't have the resources, and they were structured as such. And so what happens when we're talking about redlining communities is almost like a deliberate attempt to keep them stuck in a certain space. If we're talking about, like, I'll give you an example. I have a friend who works for an organization called Erasing the Red Line. And really, what his work is try to help erase the digital divide. And what we mean with the digital divide is that folks in red line communities, marginalized communities, don't have the internet capabilities that other folks have. And so the digital divide is a serious issue right now when we're talking about this virtual world. Because if you're taking Camden City, for example, Camden City has exclusively gone virtual for academics this year. All of their academics has gone exclusively virtual. Now, if you talk about red line communities, the average person in a home doesn't have internet access, doesn't have internet service, doesn't have a computer, may have a cell phone, and that's not always guaranteed, may have a tablet, that's not always guaranteed. So the percentages are very low for those folks who have the appropriate resources to really function in this virtual world that we have. But unfortunately, when we talk about the geography of New Jersey, you have certain communities that have been designated as red line communities, and Camden, Newark, Patterson are some of those communities that have been redlined. And you see the repetitive generational things that continue to happen in those particular communities.
And Will, if I can ask a follow-up question, then where does domestic violence and redlining cross? Because it could be easy to say, well, most of the domestic violence happens in redlined areas. Is that true? False? What is that?
Right. And so that is a big faulty assumption. That is a huge faulty assumption. The thing is what we have to understand is where data comes from. And so when we talk about data comes from social service agencies, universities, corporations, tap social service agencies and organizations to pull their data. So when we're looking at domestic violence rates, we might say, okay, well, the data looks like it's heavily happening in this area. Well, who are the folks that particularly run into social service agencies? Folks in marginalized communities, folks that need resources. So the data is skewed. I can tell you myself, after being in this work for so many years, that domestic violence is an equal opportunity abuse. It's happening everywhere. Unfortunately, when we're talking about it, it's happening in communities that, when we say suburban communities, it's happening, but it's kept quiet because you have more affluent families that don't want to, that run the risk of, you know, public embarrassment or shame or loss of respect or loss of opportunity because of, you know, if it were to leak out, if it were to come out, it would destroy the whole dynamic that they have there. So it's a big misnomer.
Thank you. Just looking at you can maybe look at the comment in the chat box. I'm going to just switch to the gallery view. If somebody could put in the chat box, I want to just make sure that everybody is seeing our gallery view now. Somebody can let me know if they're seeing the gallery view in the chat box. And I would like to give Estelle, oh, no, they're not seeing that. Well, maybe you can turn that back over to me. Your screen sharing.
You want me to screen share again, you said?
If you can maybe turn that back over to me.
Hold on a second, let's see.
Because it doesn't look like the others can see at this point.
No, you're the host, so you still
okay.
have to...
Well, I want to ask Estelle, if you could unmute yourself. I want to give you an opportunity to speak up as we begin to bring the session to a close. I know Estelle has some other announcements, but let me be the first to thank Will for his excellent presentation and thank all of you for being here. Estelle, please speak up.
Thank you, everyone, for participating. And as we said earlier, we will have more webinars. Our next one is September 26th at 11 o'clock. And it will be dealing with protective factors. We want to prevent our children from entering these risky behaviors because domestic violence relationship peer-to-peer starts very, very early. And we're going to look at resilience as one of the protective factors that we need to teach our children so that they can rise above any kind of behavior that is not healthy. So I'd like to invite you all to come back on the 26th, September 26th.
Well, thank you again, Estelle. Thank you, Will. Lots of thank yous in the chat box. We appreciate each of you that has participated today. And again, I want to alert you to the information that Will has provided, his contact information, if you would like to engage him further, either personally or otherwise. And also, some of this information should be available. And you can see Will has put that in the chat box, his NJCEDV.org. And the things that Estelle has said, but also there's information on our website, which is abcnj.net. Thank you for taking time this morning. God bless you, and may all of our spaces be sacred. Have a great day.